It's a great honor that I have the opportunity to give a keynote address at this year's version of TCT Asia Pacific. The title of the lecture is The Next Chapter of Transcatheter Valve Intervention. Obviously, since we have little time, I'll need to be very selective about how I share with you at least my thoughts on where transcatheter intervention is going in valvular heart disease. These are my disclosures. So we're going to be talking largely about transcatheter trends and future directions. And I will focus on the new area of transcatheter tricuspid valve interventions because in the United States, this has resulted in a great deal of interest over the past several months. But starting with aortic valve disease, we have focused on the lifelong journey of patients with aortic stenosis. For more than 2 decades, we have really been obsessed with being able to perfect the index procedure, making it less complex, enhancing the technology, expanding the indications. But we also think as important at this stage is what we call the upstream events in aortic valve disease, including improved diagnosis, access to care, and especially preemptive treatment, and the downstream effects after the procedure, including valve durability, concomitant cardiovascular diseases, and adjunctive pharmacotherapy. We can't share all of these ideas, but let me at least share a few of them with you. The conceptual framework of upstream AS treatment recognizes that AS is a chronic disease and that earlier management, coupled with meticulous follow-up, would lead to better outcomes. So we believe that clinical research efforts should shift from late-stage reactive AVR to early-stage preemptive AVR and other complementary approaches. Of the upstream AS treatment using preemptive AVR in the asymptomatic severe AS patients, there have been 4 studies, 2 of which in surgery, recovery, and Avatar several years ago, and 2 involving largely transcatheter therapies, early TAVR and Evolve. There are also several studies in moderate AS, particularly the at-risk patients. First, the TAVR Unload trial, and then Progress and Expand TAVR 2, Progress being the largest trial that just completed enrollment. Importantly, of these trials, 3 of them will be presented with the final outcomes at TCT later this year, Early TAVR in Evolved and TAVR Unload. So we'll begin to get evidence and data in patients with preemptive AVR therapy later in 2024. We also believe that pharmacotherapy will become an important adjunctive therapy in patients with aortic stenosis, particularly during the course of AS development and even after AVR treatment. The medical therapy largely targets the ventricle to protect a pressure-overloaded heart while AS progresses and to augment LV recovery after AVR. And there are several classes of drugs that are being looked at, particularly the SGLT2 inhibitors. So when we think now about in the future how we'll manage aortic stenosis, and we divide it in this way, looking at the hemodynamic grade of severity of the valve lesion, as well as the staging of cardiac damage associated with AS, you can see that we only have a small number of situations where AVR has a Class 1 recommendation. Many of the trials that I've just indicated will considerably improve our understanding of how to manage more categories of AS patients in the future. So to conclude, for aortic valve therapy, it will largely be transcatheter in the future. Some patients will have sole medical therapy. Others may prefer to have surgery. But TAVR will be the dominant technology and the default therapy for most AS anatomic scenarios. There are still some evidence gaps that must be addressed and resolved. The conversation will shift to bioprosthetic valve durability and preferred therapy sequencing. The upstream or earlier use of TAVR in at-risk AS will become a common theme, including the development of valve remodeling and medical therapies. And our vision is that innovation will focus on artificial intelligence for screening and device phenotyping and novel, more durable valve leaflet technologies. Mitral valve disease is messy. The anatomy is complex. The device landscape involves many different categories of devices with overlapping solutions. If we just focus for a moment on the transcatheter mitral valve replacement devices, these are the first 10 devices that were introduced into clinical use, 7 of which no longer are being used. We hit truly a dead end due to incorrect clinical assumptions, technology roadblocks, and the inability to enroll or high screen failure rates in clinical trials. We now have second-generation TMVR devices, and as you can see, 8 of them shown here. Some examples: the Intrepid 29 French transfemoral system with larger valve sizes, as you can see here, or the Innovalve TMVR system focusing on secondary MR, which has gone through the early feasibility testing. We think we can redefine a path forward for TMVR therapy. The final goal will be transeptal TMVR delivery. We'll redefine the target population and anatomic requirements. Low-profile systems will be adaptable to anatomic variability with mechanical performance in real-world anatomy, including patients with MAC, and with more flexible clinical trials with increased collaboration. So our vision of mitral valve therapy is a little bit different. We think that there will be a majority of patients that will be offered transcatheter therapies, but still an important role for medical and surgical therapy. So mitral valve disease will require a toolbox approach comprising many therapies and will certainly continue to be challenging. There will be significant edge-to-edge repair growth for both primary and secondary MR in the future, but we need expanded clinical indications and new clinical studies which are ongoing. As we mentioned, TMVR has transitioned to low-profile transeptal access and should play an increasing role in secondary MR and MAC cases. The vision will be what we call a multi-device lesion-specific approach for initial therapy, perhaps followed by combination therapies for recurrence or device failures later on in the course. And finally, tricuspid disease. Certainly in our teaching during my academic lifespan, for the most part, TR has been considered an innocent bystander. I would say over the past 20 years, there is now a great deal of evidence under a variety of circumstances indicating that in severe and moderate TR, there is an impact on mortality in patients with heart failure, MR, AS, and AI. In fact, the most recent meta-analysis demonstrated from 70 studies that TR is associated with increased mortality independent of pulmonary pressures and right heart failure. So there's no question that TR is not an innocent bystander. Importantly, we've learned a lot about how to classify tricuspid regurgitation. And here you see in some seminal work that we now have several categories of TR, including atrial functional TR, ventricular functional TR, electrode-related TR, and primary TR. We've also learned to extend the grading scheme for patients with tricuspid regurgitation so that there is both severe, massive, and torrential TR. This was necessary because patients are underdiagnosed and they're undertreated, which results in very late presentation and the need for this extended grading scheme. There are 4 different categories of new transcatheter devices that have been tested in patients under various circumstances shown on this slide. How to choose which still remains a dilemma. But recently, 2 of these devices have obtained FDA approval: a tricuspid valve replacement technology, the Evoke system, and a tricuspid edge-to-edge repair system, the TriClip, based upon the Triluminate trial. Let's talk a little bit about these studies. The Triluminate study involving the TriClip edge-to-edge repair device was a randomized trial in 350 patients, 1-to-1 versus control, looking both at reduction in TR and a hierarchical composite endpoint, including hard outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, the KCCQ score. The TRISCEND-2 study was a tricuspid replacement therapy with the EVOQUE valve that came in two parts, using what's called the Breakthrough Device Designation regulatory pathway. The first 150 patients looking at 6-month patient-reported outcomes, and then a total cohort of 400 patients of randomized patients, 2-to-1, looking at both patient-reported outcomes and hard clinical endpoints such as mortality, tricuspid valve reintervention, and annualized heart failure hospitalizations. Let's look at some of the safety and efficacy results. The TRILUMINATE study with edge-to-edge repair was extremely safe at 30 days, with only adverse events occurring in 1.7% of patients. The replacement therapy had more adverse events, even though it did fulfill non-inferiority versus a performance goal, but the adverse events rates were higher. These would need to be balanced with greater clinical benefit. Looking at TR reduction, TRILUMINATE edge-to-edge repair certainly reduced TR, but still 50% of patients had moderate TR at the end of the treatment. Looking at that primary endpoint, there were no differences in heart failure hospitalizations, death, or tricuspid valve surgery, but there was a large difference in patient-reported outcomes, KCCQ scores. Looking at TRISCEND, there was a greater reduction in tricuspid regurgitation, such that 95% had patients with reduced TR to less than moderate. There was also, at 6 months, using the hierarchical approach with patient-reported outcomes, a significant benefit in patients' symptoms. And at 12 months, importantly, there was also a significant trend benefit in hard clinical outcomes, including death, tricuspid valve intervention, and heart failure hospitalizations. So both of these devices importantly reduce TR. The safety profiles are acceptable, better with TEER than TTVR. Neither therapy impacted hard clinical outcomes at 6 months, but the later trends with TTVR certainly favored improved clinical outcomes, and both increased patient-reported outcomes at 6 months and later, perhaps slightly more so with TTVR versus edge-to-edge repair. So I would conclude and provide a future vision for tricuspid therapy that the transcatheter approach will be dominant and that there will be an explosive growth as sole therapy and combined with mitral therapy, even potential upstream treatment. You'll see technology refinements in all categories. What's needed, however, is the preferred device for specific anatomies and clinical scenarios, improved imaging for diagnosis and therapy guidance, an understanding of major risk factors, improved clinical management strategies, and rigorous heart team training. We certainly think that these facilitated regulatory approval studies in the US are important, but we recognize that long-term follow-up is needed. There needs to be further reflection on the value of patient-reported versus hard clinical endpoints, and we need expanded clinical indications in future research projects. All of these themes are going to be dealt with in great detail at an upcoming meeting called New York Valves, which was formerly our transcatheter valve therapy meeting that will be in New York City on June 5th through 7th, where we're going to take a more global perspective on valvular heart disease, focusing on imaging, clinical management, surgical therapy, transcatheter therapy, and the importance of the heart team in managing these patients before, during, and after their index procedures. So I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you at TCT Asia Pacific this year.